Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, two of the year's biggest stories were resolved this past weekend. One was the election of a United States Senator from Louisiana, and the other was the trial for the Will Smith killing. We'll look at both stories to see what was learned in the end. We'll also examine other key elections, and we will look back at the political career of David Vitter. Our Future Watch segment examines the fading movie industry and detects a bit of a pulse. On the beat for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV, Channel 4. And we're going to go first on over to Stephanie because we did it.
Finally.
No more elections. Yes. We have a new U.S. Senator
Right.
from the state of Louisiana, and it is...
It is John Kennedy, not to be confused with that other John Kennedy. And really, nobody would.
Yeah.
I mean, both smart guys, but beyond that. This was so long in coming. It felt like forever when all the other Senate races were decided. We still had this one. And you know, if you had sat down a year ago and said, how do you think this is going to go? This is the way it was going to go. Mm. So there wasn't a lot of suspense. Kennedy ended up really trouncing Foster Campbell. He got over 60% of the vote, which is remarkable even for a Republican in Louisiana. And it was really very much a party line vote. It was, especially once we got beyond the Trump election, the big national election, everybody knew the lay of the land. They knew the Republicans would have the majority. The question was how big a majority. There was kind of a little burst of national support for Foster Campbell, not really from Democratic insiders, but from just frustrated Democrats who thought, okay, there's one more election. Let's get behind this guy. What's his name? Foster Campbell. And maybe we can send a message to Trump. And that was, so if you looked at it, he raised some money and he was able to do some campaigning because of that. But if you looked at his campaign finance report, it was full of small donations from Massachusetts and Illinois and California, and that was just never going to translate to Louisiana. Louisiana went for Trump 58%. John Kennedy basically said, I'm with Trump. That was really his message, and it worked very well.
So also there was a congressional race that kind of had a surprise a bit. I mean, there was a contest.
There was. So we had two congressional races, actually, both to replace people who had run for that Senate seat and did not make the runoff, Charles Boustany and John Fleming. The North Louisiana District, Fleming's, that was a Democrat-Republican race that was very predictable. A guy named Mike Johnson won. The Acadiana race was not predictable at all. For one thing, two Republicans were in the runoff. So when that happens, anything goes. And the Republicans were a very established figure, a guy named Scott Angel, who people will remember from the governor's race last year. He finished third. He was the kind of charming Cajun guy who was really probably looking to run again in 4 years, was maybe looking to follow Bobby Jindal's footsteps and go to Congress for a few years, then run for governor. He had worked for Jindal. Jindal's team was helping with his campaign. And all of a sudden, there's this guy named Clay Higgins. And not only has he never run for office before, never been in office, he's kind of Trump-like. I mean, this was really the year of the outsider media star. And this is a guy who, in this kind of very small environment, not the big national environment, came in. He was already a YouTube star. He had been a sheriff's deputy in Acadiana, and he was the guy that did the Crime Stoppers videos. And he didn't just do normal, boring Crime Stoppers videos. He really kind of made an art of it. He wore his uniform, he looked into the camera, he talked tough to the perp, he kind of mocked the perps in some ways. I watched one where he was standing in front of a restaurant that had been robbed, and he said, these are good people, they make the South what it is. When you're caught, you're going to be eating your horrible prison food. I'm going to be in here eating a hamburger. And they went kind of viral. So people knew who he was, and he ran a very anti-establishment campaign. Scott Angels had a lot of political posts over many years. It was easy to tie him to Bobby Jindal. Clay Higgins, he had some personal baggage like Trump. He had, a lot of back alimony there, but again, like Trump, it didn't really matter. People really just responded to this
That's the advantage of being an outsider. When you're an outsider, the baggage doesn't seem to matter as much.
It's really interesting.
It's when you're an insider that you need to answer all those questions.
Right. I wonder why. And I guess people, and he kind of said the same thing Trump said, which is, look, I'm fallible. I never claim, it just proves I'm not a polished politician almost. I mean, he almost turned it to his advantage.
And even some of those videos, which generated a little bit of controversy, being so direct. I think some people said there were strains of some racism, perhaps, but they seemed to work in his favor among that constituency.
They really did. And again, it was almost like if you compare it to the Republican primaries, the presidential primaries, there was a very big field, and there was someone who was different from everybody else, and he, again, in this environment where it was hard to get attention, people already knew him. He was an entertainment figure almost as much as a political figure, and now he's going to Congress.
And so the defeated Angel and Campbell are both on the Public Service Commission.
They
remain
are.
there.
So that's, I guess, the bright side is we'll have some stability on the Public Service Commission because they're both going to stay.
But we have 3 newbies in our congressional delegation.
Correct.
The senator
and the 2 members of Congress, and then several others who are just 2 years in. So it's a very junior delegation.
With this new administration. So how do you anticipate our delegation working with the Trump administration?
I mean, I think it's going to be tough. The person to watch really is Steve Scalise, I'd say, who is, of course, the majority whip, and he seems to be formulating a good relationship with the administration. Remember, unlike Paul Ryan, he was always with Trump. He was never, he never did this kind of dance that Paul Ryan did. And the other thing is he has a pretty good relationship with Mike Pence. They served in the House together and they were allies, and I think that's going to be an important relationship.
But he's also right. And Richmond.
And exactly, on the Democratic side, the only Democrat is about to become head of the Black Caucus, and they, again, we have a nice Republican-Democrat 1-2 punch here because Richmond and Scalise, although of different parties, they came up together in the Louisiana legislature. They're good friends. We're already hearing stories of how they're maneuvering things to help each other, which will be good for the state.
Okay, elections over, but local elections too. You wanted to get into the results for local elections.
Yeah, several elections on the ballot. A couple of them to fill vacancies in Plaquemines Parish. Amos Cormier III was elected. He's an attorney in Plaquemines Parish. He was elected to fill the unexpired seat of his father, who died in office last June, and there's 2 years left to the term. He defeated Kirk Lapine, who was a parish president, so it'll be Amos Cormier III. In Kenner finally resolved the having a mayor, and it'll be Ben Zahn who won handily. So those elections go on. Also, Jefferson Parish, there were several renewals on the ballot. There was 1 sales tax renewal and 3 property tax renewals for various things like recreation and various causes. All of them passed handily. Today, the Yinny administration sent out a press release, sort of like taking bows for it, but also saying, well, the other parish officials work for this too. How much credit they can take, but they did say they were not for us. Some of these things would not have been on the ballot, and it was a good thing they were. In Orleans Parish, sometimes there's something that just kind of seems totally unglamorous, but in the whole way of the world, maybe the most important thing. And something very important that happened in Orleans Parish is voters rarely, something they very rarely do is to increase the tax on themselves, and that was a sales tax for fire protection. And this will go a big way towards dealing with a major problem that the city has had.
It's the property tax.
Yeah, I'm sorry, a property tax. With the problem that they've had for paying the back due money on the firefighters, that has really hampered mayors, and this will be a big step for them.
That was key to the settlement that was arrived at. The settlement, however, didn't come with the money to pay for it, and now this does.
Yeah. And so that was a big deal, and it's going to make a big difference in the future in terms of future budgets and financing things. And then also there was a sewage and water board renewal, which was expected. So overall, all the propositions, all the renewals, and the 1 new tax all passed. So in that sense, it was a good day for all the anti-establishment feeling out there. People were doing things that had been established already. So
remember when the fire and police millages were coupled, it went down, but with fire alone, it passed. So I don't know if that says anything about how voters think of police versus fire. But
Or if they're just tired of hearing about needing to pay the firefighters and want it done.
And also turnout,
Well,
too,
there was
because
a
this
lot
was
of-
a really low turnout election.
Part
I
of
should
what
say.
they were saying with the police was that it increased new police positions. A lot of people say, great, we want more police, but there are a lot of people in the community who don't want more police. Right? And so
And there were stories
I
of
think
how they were
that's-
having trouble even finding people to fill the positions they had.
So
So-
the fire proposition on its own does pass.
Yes.
Elections are done for right now until we get to next year and get started again on
Yes.
something else. But that's it for this conversation about elections. Okay, we're going over now to just a major trial that occurred last week with the verdict rendered on Sunday, and then of course was the Cardell Hayes trial, who was charged with second-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder for the killing of Will Smith and the shooting of his wife Raquel.
That's right. And of course, when you have some national media and a packed courtroom, basically people waiting outside who could not get in. You're talking about a major trial, and this was gavel to gavel, 6 days into Saturday, a verdict finally late on a Sunday. And I think Deuce McAllister might have put it best after the verdict was delivered for guilty of manslaughter and guilty of attempted manslaughter, that nobody was a winner. Everybody lost. It was just a tremendous and senseless tragedy on so many levels, not just for Will Smith, his family, his wife, who's recovering, not just psychologically, but physically from being shot in the legs herself, that entire family, all of Will Smith's sort of saints, friends, and extended Saints Nation, but Cardell Hayes, who now looks at the possibility of up to 60 years in prison, 40 for manslaughter, 20 for attempted manslaughter.
Effectively a life sentence.
If those run consecutive, which is rare, usually they run concurrent, but he's eligible for that, and this was certainly very high profile. And a judge, Camille Burris, not known for light sentences, could be troubling. But I think another factor has to be taken into consideration here is that the verdicts were 10-2, with the 2 votes going to not guilty. And of the 10 for manslaughter, we heard from an alternate juror and a juror who sat in on deliberations afterward, who said that second-degree murder was taken off the table right away. And it does seem to match the facts. Second-degree murder implies some kind of cool reflection, either some premeditation, and this was, let's face it, an accident that led to some road rage, heated words, a drunk Will Smith, almost 3 times the legal limit, intoxicated, all fueling this happenstance incident that turned into a tragedy on the street.
And as you say, the verdict was 10-2, and not a unanimous verdict.
Right.
And in the state of Louisiana and the state of Oregon, that is allowed.
The only 2 states in the country that do not require a unanimous verdict of a jury.
So, Mike, now that we've gone through the trial, do we understand for sure exactly what happened that night?
Much better. There were still some unanswered questions, but leave it to that sort of wisdom of a jury. They rely on their own experiences and sort of their, gut level feeling about the big picture to maybe weed out the things that were, really not critical and boil it down. And speaking to, the one alternate juror who, by the way, by virtue of being an alternate, you think, well, that person was not in deliberations, but they were sequestered the entire time with the regular jury, and we're all together afterward, sharing how'd you come to that decision, and we got a very clear picture of just what the jury zeroed in on. And number 1 was the actual position of Will Smith and his wife. Will Smith, being shot in the left side, was facing away from his driver's side door. Not, as Cardell Hayes testified, reaching in, or Cardell Hayes even went further, saying he had a gun, he saw a gun, and nobody else corroborated that. And furthermore, the hard science, the forensics, showed that first shot to Will Smith was in his left side, facing away from his vehicle. So that was a major factor. Factor number 2, and this was, once again, it went to scientific evidence, the ballistics and autopsy report had 7 shots to Will Smith's back. 6 of those were bullets that lodged in his body, which makes it unable to determine the trajectory of the bullet. One of them was a through-and-through wound that sort of entered low middle back and exited up high around his shoulder, showing that his position was either lying flat or, as some of the witnesses said, slumped over his driver's seat as well as steering wheel. So he was down. He was man down. And so in the wisdom of this jury, they basically said that, number one, Will Smith was not leaning in his car, reaching for a gun. Number two, there were 2 shots and then a pause followed by 7 or 8 additional shots, meaning that there was a moment when it looked like the threat, if there was a threat to Cardell Hayes, had basically evaporated. No more threat if you shot 2 people. And that then one of those subsequent shots was clearly as Will Smith was flat on his face, wounded.
The jury did acquit him of one charge, which was the crash involving
That was
the
aggravated
crash.
criminal damage to property, and that was significant in the sense that that stemmed from him ramming or crashing into the back of Will Smith's Mercedes. They took that off the table, that was not the act of aggression. They did have to find some act of aggression, that it was initiated by Will Smith, but it wasn't that. It really boiled down to those split seconds when a gun's pulled and then used, and where were people standing. And Will Smith, clearly there were heated words, but they determined that was not enough to present a threat that would require a response of death or great bodily harm.
His defense attorneys say that they will appeal.
Right.
And one juror was quoted, one juror was interviewed who was a woman who said that she would seek leniency in terms of sentencing.
And that very well may happen, but that has no weight with the sentencing judge whatsoever. There is a pre-sentence investigation, somewhat of a formality, but it looks into Cardell Hayes' background, his prior criminal record, which is very light, very minimal. And he's had great personal tragedy in his life. His father shot and killed by police. So really just tragedy all around.
All around. I mean, just heartbreak. It must have really been very tough listening to all of this in the
Nobody
courtroom.
wins. Nobody wins.
And we'll continue to hear more about it, I'm sure. Thanks, Mike. We're going to go over to Dawn right now. And sort of, as Errol wrote, we're sort of feeling a pulse again in the movie industry.
Yes, the folks at the Office of Economic Development would tell you Hollywood South never really left. It's been here the whole time. There has been a dip from the high years, especially when the tax credit cap was initiated. But it really is coming back bigger than it's been in quite some time. 3 feature films getting ready to start shooting in the early part of 2017. 1 feature film that was directed by Michael Landon's son just wrapped up. And some star power back in town and coming to town. Kate Bosworth will be here starring in a film that starts shooting it started shooting actually mid-November. We'll wrap up in the early part of the year. An actor named Ted Levine coming in, and 3 different TV shows shooting, which the economic development people say are actually, the big budget films are the ones that get all the attention, but the TV shows like NCIS New Orleans, which is in its 3rd consecutive season shooting here, they come in for 9 and 10 months, and they employ a ton of people and use a bunch of locations, all of which they rent and pay for, and catering every day, and buying parking spaces on the street every day, and makeup people every day. So they contribute a lot of money when they're here, and they spend more locally. These are actors who come in. Scott Bakula, really coming from NCIS New Orleans, becoming part New Orleanian while he's here. And there will be more announcements, they say, coming in the first quarter. Stay tuned for a show called Shadows, tentatively called Shadows. They often are produced as one thing, and then when they roll out, they have a new name. But Shadows, which is a Disney production that's coming in. The Preacher TV series in its 2nd season here. And you might say, why is it coming back? And why in these numbers? A lot of it, they say, is really just Governor Edwards stepping up and saying, look, Hollywood, we will honor our commitment. We have the money. The cap hasn't been hit. The money's available, and they're coming. We also have a very good infrastructure of talent, both in terms of the people who can be the grips and the photographers and the lighting people and the makeup people and the sound studio and the caterers and everybody who's used to dealing with it, that the infrastructure is in place. To quantify it a little bit, when a $100 million film comes to town, more than 1,000 people end up working. Local people end up working on that film sometimes. A $5 million feature can employ as many as 300 people. When Deepwater Horizon was shooting here, about 200 welders had jobs because of that movie. So, you know, it's the economic development folks say it has been very hard to quantify whether or not these tax credits really do work, because every film is different in terms of who's working and who's not working. I met last week with an accountant who has work here because he's an accountant in Hollywood. You know, you think of all the creative types, it's not just. He said, "Trust me, I don't do creative accounting." It's not. It's all different types of jobs. In 2017, the Economic Development Office has been tasked by the governor to come up with a 4-point comprehensive plan that shows sustainability for this industry, greater fiscal predictability, greater statewide impact, and a better return on investment.
So we have more productions coming even with the existing cap.
Even with the existing cap. And the other thing you can't quantify is the exposure, because you have key decision makers saying we are an entertainment destination consistently ranking in the top 5.
Well, that's good. We have to move quickly over to Stephanie now, because we did want to get a quick retrospective on David Vitter.
David Vitter, yes. Think of how long we've all been watching David Vitter. It's been 25 years that he's been in public office. He started off in the legislature. People were watching him from the beginning because he ran in that seat that David Duke had held in Metairie. And his first term, he just really made a name for himself with these reform measures that he became known for early on in his, he was always conservative, but his reputation was as less of an ideologue back then and more as a good government type. And again, early on, he took on the Edwin Edwards administration. That was that 4th administration on gambling and ethics. He went after those Tulane scholarships, remember, that politicians used to give to their kids and their friends. And term limits, that was his big thing.
Big term limits guy.
He was the term limits guy. It's funny because Jay Darden handled it over in the Senate, but David Vitter was always the term limits guy. He ran for Congress, beat Dave Treen, who the entire establishment supported. Of course, David Vitter, term limits, that's not how you make friends with other politicians, put them on term limits and go after their sweetheart deals. So he was always someone who kind of, would battle other politicians. In Washington, I think he continued to do that, but he also became much more of a Republican Party guy and a kind of ideological conservative. You hear about sanctuary cities now, that he was on that issue early on. Very socially conservative, very anti-Obama when Obama came along. But I did a column that's running this weekend and looked at his actual legacy in terms of passing legislation. And the interesting thing, I think, is that his lasting impact in terms of legislation will be on issues that were not those things. They were not the reform measures. They were not the ideological measures. They were things where he actually teamed up with some very liberal Democrats, actually. He passed several versions of the big water resources, national water resources bill with Barbara Boxer from California. One of his signature bills is a chemical safety bill that reformed, how the government dealt with regulating chemicals for the first time in 40 years. People have been fighting for it for a long time with a couple of liberal Democrats. So I think maybe the lesson here is, maybe look at what he did, not just what he said, for a sign of his effectiveness.
And so what is next for him? What is he going to do?
We don't know yet.
Okay.
Remember when Mitt Romney's campaign was coming together? He was briefly mentioned as a possible vice presidential candidate with Mitt Romney. I mean, somebody from the South. He looked good until people started digging into his past.
Well, 2007 was really the key year because that's when the prostitution scandal came out, and at that point he did not have a national future. Before then, he really was still considered an up-and-comer. Okay. But he will serve out his term, and the private sector awaits, he says.
So your column this Sunday?
Yes.
In the paper. Okay, great. Over to Errol, and our mayor met with the president-elect.
Yeah,
New
he
Orleans
and
mayor.
several other mayors met with Donald Trump briefly yesterday. They said it was about a 20-minute meeting. Landrieu is the vice president-elect of the National Conference of Mayors, and so in that capacity, he was there. And the main thing they talked about was infrastructure improvement, and a big issue for them is tax exemption on municipal bonds. The mayors just seemed to feel like they were well received. It was a brief meeting. But I was thinking, most presidents have not come from cities. Most of them have come from small towns. I mean, if ever there was a big city guy, it's Donald Trump.
That's
who was born in Queens and lived most of his life in New York City. But the thing that came to mind was when when Mitch Landrieu's father, Moon Landrieu, was mayor. He was president of the National League of Cities, or the Conference of Mayors, and at the same time that New York was facing its bankruptcy. And that had been like around 75. That was when there was a famous Gerald Ford headline, Ford to New York, drop dead. And it was the mayor of New Orleans who was going to Washington to actually lobby to help save New York. He was a real force in that. And so I just thought about that, all those years ago with the mayor of New Orleans. And here's the current mayor of New Orleans going to New York to try to get help for the cities.
And hopefully he will, and the other mayors will be successful, because cities certainly still need assistance. Okay, it is now time for us to look ahead.
Tomorrow is the New Orleans Bowl, the R+L Carriers New Orleans Bowl, and that's significant because R+L Carriers has renewed for 5 more years until 2021. Anyway, ULL and Southern Mississippi play tomorrow. ULL's played 4 times in the New Orleans Bowl, never lost. Southern Mississippi and ULL have played each other outside of the bowl, and Southern Mississippi has never lost to ULL. So somebody's going to lose something for the first time tomorrow. So.
Okay. Stephanie?
Well, John Kennedy's going to the Senate, which means there will be an election for state treasurer coming up. It's been scheduled for the fall, and I think a lot of people are going to sign up for that.
Yeah,
So,
I keep reading a long list of people who
Exactly.
are going, including Caroline Fayard is a name.
a lot of legislators. I think it's not so much fun being in the legislature these
Julie
days.
Stokes, I think,
Julie
is in
Stokes
it.
is
So,
one.
yeah,
John
that-
Schroeder from this area.
Yeah, that list really does keep growing.
does.
Okay.
Fan favorite New Orleans tradition, Sunday night is caroling in Jackson Square. The gates open, I believe it's 6:30, and you can go get your song sheet and candle and carol with thousands of your closest friends in Jackson Square. It's a lot of fun, but the weather's supposed to be
It may
very
be raining,
iffy.
yeah.
Oh, really? Raining?
Yes, and very cold.
Oh, really? So we're going to go back to cold on Sunday.
We're going to go back to cold, I think, 80 maybe tomorrow, and
Yeah.
then cold on Sunday.
Wow,
Not
okay.
that I'm a meteorologist, but I'll play one on TV.
Okay. Mike?
Well, we have to keep an eye on this big FBI raid up in Hammond, Hammond
Yes.
Police Department. It seems to stem from the suspension of some DEA agents, federal agents, on corruption allegations, but significant because it's the brother of John Bell Edwards, a police chief up there, so it's going to bear some watching to see what happens as a result of this raid. Boxes and boxes carted out of there.
Yeah, that was just, what, Thursday?
That's
When it
correct.
was so
Yes.
will you guys be following up on that at Channel 4?
Yeah, when it's the feds, we really have to kind of wait to see, what the next step
Right.
is. Charges, indictments, more warrants, but something's brewing.
Okay, All right, thanks guys for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.